Hi, I'm Cara McGlynn, School Social Worker at Core Education Center.
Hi, I'm Dan Porter. I'm the lead for social work across programs on special assignment.
And I'm Nadia Phelps. I'm the school psychologist at South Campus.
In August of 2017, a new rule regarding teacher licensure in the state of Minnesota went into effect. Here you will be able to read the actual statute if you'd like to. A general overview is that every 5 years, you will need 1 hour of suicide prevention training. Just like all teaching strategies, what are considered best practices change and evolve with more research. Newer research and exploration has gone into suicide prevention and will likely impact the content you will see when you participate in this training during your 5-year renewal cycle. In today's training, we hope that participants will understand their role in evidence-informed best practices for suicide prevention in the school setting, including understanding how your personal bias plays a role in suicide prevention, understanding the warning signs of suicide, what to say and what not to say, what you do with information that you possibly gather, and what happens after you make a report. To begin this training, it is important to define common terms that we will use throughout. Suicide is defined as death caused by self-directed injurious behavior with the intent to die as a result of the behavior. A suicide attempt is a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with the intent to die as a result of the behavior. A suicide attempt might not result in injury. Suicidal ideation refers to thinking about, considering, or planning one's suicide. What we say or don't say, and how we say it, makes a difference. Our words matter to those struggling with thoughts of ending their own lives, and to those reeling from loss owing to suicide. Avoid the phrase committed suicide. It's heavily values loaded, and it implies typically a sin or crime. When we commit things in our society, we're typically talking about it in a negative connotation, and it pathologizes those that have been affected by suicide. Please use more objective phrasing, like died from or by suicide, ended their own life or took their life, death by suicide. If we're using the right language, if we're pulling the negative connotations out of our language, talking about suicide is easier. It breaks down the barriers and walls when working with our students. So, why is it important to your practice that you understand suicide prevention? We know that a student's mental health can impact their academic performance. Education assistants and classroom teachers are on the front lines and see students daily. Often, our education assistants and classroom teachers are the first persons to identify potential warning signs that we will be talking about later. Our staff at 916 are in the position to support our mental health and related services staff with a ton of information. Long before a student ends up in real crisis, you'll probably have some inclination that there's something going on. You are vital to supporting our students' success. We're going to take some time now for personal reflection. Please take 3 to 5 minutes after you've located the 916 Thoughts, Feelings, and Reactions handout on Schoology. When you have a printed copy, please read each statement and indicate T for true next to items that you have heard, thought, etc., or false, meaning you've not heard this, thought this, etc. Please also include your first thoughts as you read each statement. Include your feelings and first impressions. It's important for the self-reflection activity for you to be very honest. No one will see this sheet except for yourself, and this will be a helpful tool as we continue the training.
Reflecting on both our personal worksheets and the video, we are going to have an opportunity to think further about each of the statements on these worksheets. The majority of statements on the sheet are in fact myths about suicide. They are commonly thought, spoken, throughout our culture. We are taking the time today to consider both our own personal thoughts and reactions and the actual facts regarding suicide. Although people might think that people who talk about suicide won't do it, the facts are that almost everyone who attempts or dies by suicide has given warning signs through their words or behaviors. Do not ignore any suicide threats. Statements like, "You'll be sorry when I'm dead," or "I wish I was dead," no matter how casual or jokingly said, may indicate serious suicidal feelings. Trained mental health staff don't expect you to be able to tell if it's a flippant remark or something serious. Your role as an educator is to listen, hear them, and be that support person. Although people might think that once a person is determined to commit suicide, nothing is going to stop them. Even the most severely depressed person has mixed feelings about death, wavering until the very last moment between wanting to die and wanting to live. Most suicidal people do not want to die. They want the pain to stop. The impulse to end their life, however overpowering, does not last forever. Remember, in the video, Kevin said the millisecond his hands left the bridge, he had a regret. Although people might worry that talking about suicide might give someone the idea, the facts are you do not give a person an idea about suicide by talking about it. The opposite is true. If a person is depressed or unhappy, discussing their feelings openly and allowing them to express how they feel is one of the most helpful things you can do. Even if they have had suicidal thoughts, giving them permission to express those thoughts can relieve some of the anxiety and provide an avenue to recognize other ways to escape their pain and sadness. As educators, we have to be brave enough to hear hard stories, ask tough questions, and follow through to make sure our students are safe. Although people might think someone talking about suicide is talking about it for attention, the facts are that to a certain degree, they are trying to get attention and help for the pain that they are experiencing. A suicide attempt, even half-hearted, is an attempt to seek help. If a person perceives their action to be a suicide attempt, then that is what it is. An attempt, regardless of severity, must be taken seriously, and help must be sought for the individual. This goes back to the definition we talked about earlier. Both suicide attempt and death by suicide including an emphasis on intent. If the student says, "My intent of holding my breath was to die," then it was an attempt on their life. Although people might think that asking someone about suicidal intent could increase their risk, the facts are that asking someone directly about their suicidal intent lowers anxiety, opens up communication, and lowers the risk of an impulsive act. Remember, people feeling suicidal are often scared of being made fun of for feeling suicidal. If you ask directly, they will feel less embarrassed. Being direct shows that you are listening, that you are paying attention, and that you care. In the video, Kevin felt right up until he jumped that no one cared. All these people around him, and no one cared. Although people might think that a chance for the better means we are in the clear, the facts are sudden changes from showing signs of depression, expression of suicidal thoughts to extreme happiness may indicate that they are at peace with completing suicide or are happy they have made that decision. If people start to give things away or do things that are extra nice, like giving compliments, extending thank yous, this change is worth noting, further exploring, especially if it is out of their character. Although people might often think the grass is greener on the other side, the facts are that suicide knows no boundaries. It occurs across all ages, economic, social, and ethnic. Even though Kevin was born with some very difficult struggles, he said himself that he had a great childhood and he had great supports. Things just spiraled out of control. Although people might think that we can only rely on the experts, the facts are that prevention is everyone's job. Anyone can be a supportive, caring adult. If a person or student confides in you, it is because they feel you are safe and you are their person. I want to remind you that this may seem scary, but I challenge you to turn that feeling of being scared into a feeling of being honored that students see you as a safe person, and you have the tools to help them remain safe. Although people might think that suicide is selfish, the facts are people who attempt or die by suicide are truly thinking that their friends and family are better off without them. There are many emotions that are felt after someone experiences a suicide attempt or death by suicide of someone close to them. Feeling that they are selfish is one I hear over and over again. I want to remind you that people like Kevin often are feeling like they are a burden. Kevin thought that his family was better off without him, and a lot of times after time, loved ones of those who die by suicide begin to think differently. It is important to think about the population being studied when statements are made about trends in suicide. For example, while the overall data in Minnesota indicates that there has been a slight decrease in students' rates of suicide in recent history, looking deeper into the data, one could see that the increase in Greater Minnesota starting in 2015 was matched by the decrease in the 7-county metro area starting at the same time. It may feel like pockets of places have more suicides than others. We also need to recognize that discussions about the causes of death and the stigma surrounding suicide has changed over time. What are some observations that a shift has begun regarding the stigma of death by suicide?
It's a common misperception that youth with intellectual disabilities or cognitive impairments are not at risk of suicide because they do not understand the finality of death. What we know, unfortunately, is that suicide risk does exist in the ID population, and that these youth think about, attempt, and sadly die by suicide. Children and adolescents with intellectual disabilities actually develop comorbid mental health disorders at a rate 3 to 4 times higher than their non-ID peers. Studies report that youth with ID are at risk for suicidal thoughts, behaviors, and death by suicide, with rates as high as 42%. And what is leading to this? Why are they at a higher risk? Well, we do know that people with ID are reported to experience more abuse, more neglect, they increase stigma and peer exclusion, and then they tend to be more socially disadvantaged. All of these factors then increase their risk of developing mental health disorders. In addition, many of these youth also have difficulty verbalizing their distress and asking for help. And so this puts them at risk for having undetected mental health conditions that are then undiagnosed and untreated, and their suicidal thoughts and behaviors then may be left undetected. Although we are transitioning into statistics and away from the personal examination of our own thoughts and beliefs, we'd like you to try to keep your personal thoughts in the forefront of your mind while you consider the data and think about the students that we serve. Please take 3 to 5 minutes to review the statistics information sheet that you have as a handout. Take a moment to look through the information. Place an exclamation point by any piece of information that surprises you. And place a question mark by any piece of information that you are wondering or are curious about. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has provided us with some national statistics regarding suicide. It deems that youth suicide is a serious national health problem. Suicide rates are up in the U.S. as a whole, increasing by 30% across all age groups in the last decades. The suicide in Minnesota actually jumped 40.9% over the past 18 years. Suicide rates rose in all but one state between 1999 and 2016. It is believed that one of the reasons that suicide rates are a bit higher in Minnesota and other Midwestern states, as well as some other rural areas, are because of readily available firearms due to a hunting culture. The Minnesota Student Survey gives us more local statistics. The survey has been utilized to elicit feedback from students in our states since 1989. It is conducted every 3 years, it's anonymous, and it's statewide and conducted in schools. It is conducted to gain insights into the world of students and their experiences. In addition to asking students about suicidality, students respond to other questions on school climate, bullying, out-of-school activities, health and nutrition, emotional and mental health, relationships, substance abuse, and other such topics. It is a voluntary survey, and it can be administered to students in the 5th, 8th, 9th, and 11th grades who attend public schools, charter schools, tribal schools, and other non-public schools. In 2016, the Northeast Metro916 district also administered this survey to students in the 9th and 11th grades. According to the 2016 Minnesota Student Survey, 11.8% of 9th graders in Minnesota had thoughts of suicide in the last year, and 3.7% had actually attempted suicide. Suicide was the leading cause of death for youth between the ages of 10 and 17 years of age. Now, looking at the statistics for Northeast Metro 916, we asked the questions, have you ever seriously considered attempting suicide? If you look at the chart, 25% of 9th graders responded that they had during the last year, and 29% of 11th graders had. When we look at more than 1 year ago, 32% of 9th graders responded that they had seriously considered suicide, and 26% of the 11th graders responded this way. When we look at statistics regarding actual suicide attempts, 9th graders responded that they had made an attempt during the last year at the rate of 11%, and 4% of 11th graders had made such an attempt. If we look at statistics for over a year ago, then the statistics from 9th graders is 15%, and the statistics for 11th graders is 16%. So looking at that, it seems like we need to make sure that we are addressing these concerns and that we are making sure that we touch base with our students. Staff in our schools will need to have a good grasp of what to look for, what to be concerned about, and then what to do in order to help our students remain safe and to move them away from suicidality. So the statistics that we have reviewed are concerning and reinforce the idea that suicidal behavior is definitely a public health issue, both at the national level and in our schools locally. When we look at who is at risk, between 2008 and 2015, the number of youth contemplating suicide almost doubled. And by 2016, suicide was actually the second leading cause of death among young people. So we know that younger people are at higher risk for suicide. Although there is really no stereotypical suicidal type of young person, the statistics on youth suicide indicate that some groups are at a higher risk for suicide than others. Suicide risk is greater among people with more than one risk factor. And then for those already at risk, a triggering event might increase their suicidal risk. And when we look at what are some of these triggering events, we know that situational crises such as the death of a loved one, physical or sexual abuse, family violence might increase the level of risk. Social isolation, such as when a student moves to a new school, a new home. We at our district have students coming from other districts, so they may be changing settings, losing some of the connections that they had in the past. Periods of prolonged stress caused by harassment, bullying, relationship problems, etc., also are risk factors. A very high risk factor is a prior suicide attempt or an exposure to another person's suicide or death. Helping students connect with peers is helpful, as is building relationships with students so that they have at least one adult that they feel comfortable with. We know that how one thinks about oneself and the messages we give ourselves can act as risk factors or protective factors related to suicide risk. Looking at whether we come from a framework of guilt rather than shame is important. So students that have the guilt framework look at things as, if they've made an error, they look at, I made a mistake, whereas the person who comes from a shame framework thinks they are a mistake. I am a mistake. In the guilt framework, the student thinks I did something bad versus I am bad. This leads to, the guilt framework leads us to the feeling that we can connect to other people. It's normal to make a mistake. Whereas the shame base, the I am bad, there is something wrong with me, leads to more disconnection from other people and sort of withdrawing, which is, a risk factor for suicidal ideation and other kinds of risk behaviors. Guilt is temporary. Something happened, I feel bad about it, I made a mistake, I can do something to repair it, and I can move on. Whereas with the shame, it's a internalization of being a bad person. It's who I am. I'm a bad person. I am a mistake, and I cannot change. And again, that leads to that sort of tunnel vision that can be very problematic in terms of all kinds of risk behaviors and mental health issues, and can lead to suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior. Next, we're going to look at the impact of social media. We know that preliminary research is going on into the possible relationship between social media and mental health issues, especially depression and anxiety, and a possible connection to suicidality. It's important to note that the information comes mainly from a single study, and that it does not provide conclusive evidence on the possibility of this relationship between suicide and social media. While we keep these parameters in mind, it also helps us to think about the high-tech youth culture and the ways digital worlds of our students can present as both stressors and opportunities. Now, we know that one of the apps that are used very frequently is Snapchat. Snapchat allows users to send messages, primarily photos and videos that are destroyed seconds after they've been received. The service is marketed to teens with the capture the moment messaging and plays on its contrast to Facebook, which archives every post and pic for years. So Snapchat's fleeting image offers users the illusion of anonymity, but screenshots can be taken. And the biggest risk here is sending inappropriate content, thinking that it can't be used against them. On Vine, users create and post 6-second videos, which are often also shared on Twitter and Facebook. We can expect plenty of inappropriate content here, including enough sex and drugs to earn the app a 17+ rating in the iTunes Store. With an unverified confirmation of the age requirement, users are ready to post videos. Blocking who watches the video requires constant vigilance to make sure that videos are not shown to strangers. We know that these apps are being developed very quickly. Some of these apps may not even be used that often anymore by youth, but we know that they are definitely ahead of us as adults on what is out there and how to keep things from the adults who are trying to monitor social media usage. Again, right now there's not conclusive evidence, but we do know that the types of things that are being posted, the online bullying, the threats that are made, the kinds of things that are going on are just increasing the level of stress for youth at the moment.
Preliminary research into a possible relationship between social media and suicide continues to emerge. It is important to note that the information highlighted here is from a single study, and it does not provide conclusive evidence on the relationship between suicide and social media. While we keep these parameters in mind, it also helps us to think about the high-tech youth culture and the ways our digitalized world creates both opportunities and stressors for our students.
When we look at gender disparities in the United States, we know that suicide amongst males is 4 times higher than among females. Male deaths represent 79% of all U.S. suicides. Females, on the other hand, are more likely than males to have had suicidal thoughts and to have made a suicide attempt 3 times as often as males. Now, we like to think about why is there such a discrepancy between the genders, and some of the thoughts are that males are more likely to make a suicide gesture or a suicide attempt using more lethal methods. They tend to use things like firearms and motor vehicles, whereas females are more likely to use overdoses and means where there is a little bit more time between the actual act of making the suicidal gesture and the ability for somebody to intervene so that they can be helped and that they can survive it. So that's some of the thinking at this time of why there are such gender disparities. We also know that females tend to communicate with friends and reach out for help at a higher rate than males in this current, in the culture. We can also look at age disparities in terms of who is most at risk. 1 in 100,000 children ages 10 to 14 die by suicide each year. 7 in 100,000 youth ages 15 to 19 die by suicide each year. Suicide is the third leading cause of death for 15 to 24-year-old Americans. So we know that this is the highest risk is the adolescent to young adult years. Another area where we see discrepancy is between sexual orientation and gender identity. So we know that lesbian, gay, and bisexual kids are 3 times more likely than straight kids to attempt suicide at some point in their lives. African American, Latino, Native American, and Asian American people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual attempt suicide at especially high rates. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual young people who come from families that reject or do not accept them are over 8 times more likely to attempt suicide than those whose families accept them. Each time an LGBTQ person is a victim of physical or verbal harassment or abuse, they become 2.5 times more likely to hurt themselves. Now, we've spent some time looking at what increases risk for our students. And now we're going to turn to resiliency factors. The presence of resiliency factors or assets can actually minimize the risk of suicide amongst young people. Remember that having these resiliency factors does not equate to the student being immune to risk. And it is also important for us to remember that our perception of the student's resiliency factors may not be how they actually view themselves, their current situation, or their life in general. Resiliency factors include family support and cohesion and good family communication, peer support, close social networks, school and community connectedness, adaptive coping and problem-solving skills such as conflict resolution, general life satisfaction, positive self-esteem and a sense of purpose, and easy access to effective medical care and mental health resources. Now, in looking at these resiliency factors, we can see many areas where our work here at 916 can help support students so that these are increased. Remember that having these resiliency factors does not equate to the student being immune to risk. And it is important for us to remember that our perception does not mean that this is how they see themselves and that they feel that they have the resources to. Differences in cultural background can influence how students respond to stressors, the way they talk about death or dying, their attitudes and beliefs about suicide, and how they feel about sharing personal information, and how they feel about speaking with school staff and seeking help from others. As staff, our own personal religious, spiritual, and cultural beliefs also play a part in how we respond. We need to be aware and sensitive to this. Hence, our opening activity in our training today, where we looked at our underlying beliefs. Being aware of our own bias and intentionally acting to counter these biases if they will impede efforts to secure the safety and well-being of our students will position us to be the best advocates we can be for our students and for our schools. It is important to be mindful of possible differences and to respond with cultural sensitivity. For example, a student or family may not be open to talking with a school mental health professional about their feelings or suicidal ideation. However, they may be willing to talk with a traditional healer or faith leader from their own community. Faith, religion, and spiritual beliefs also play a factor in how a family responds to the notion of suicide. Keep in mind that it is considered a sin in many religions and a crime in some jurisdictions. In recent years, however, many faith traditions have modified their views of suicide and looked more closely at what their role should be in both prevention and in healing.
As previously mentioned, there are often indicators that a person may be in danger and that they may be in need of urgent help. Obviously, increased use of alcohol and drugs increases the chance of impulsive actions. Generally speaking, watching for changes in a student's pattern of behavior and noticing when there are sudden changes, regardless if you would perceive them to be positive or negative, can be important. Typically, a student will not come out and say, "I want to die." They'll often use indirect language, talking about their feelings of hopelessness or having no purpose. They'll talk about feeling trapped or being in unbearable pain and feeling as though they're a burden to others. Self-injurious behavior can be a significant risk factor for suicide. However, most incidents of self-injury are not meant as a suicide attempt. Most often, it is a sign of stress and the need for alternative ways to deal with that stress. If you see self-harm, you should alert the student's mental health staff so that they can further assess the situation.
Looking at suicidal behavior and special needs, I think we often think automatically about students with the educational categories of EBD, maybe OHD. We're looking at people with mental illnesses or, depression, anxiety. We might look at students or think of students with ADHD as being at higher risk. However, what we do know from research is that individuals with autism and intellectual disabilities and other physical limitations can also struggle with feelings of being excluded or feeling different, and this can contribute to suicidal thought processes. We've kind of talked a bit about risk factors associated with youth and special ed, but we need to also think of protective factors. And in thinking specifically of the students we have here at District 916, some of the protective factors that we have is that students in our programs are receiving very high levels of support. They are on individual education plans, so that what they are being asked to do or tasked to do is actually at a level where they are able to achieve it. There are low teacher to student ratios, which increases the levels of support in the classroom, but also increases supervision and especially opportunities to develop caring relationship with adults. We know that the most significant factor in terms of mental wellness for youth is having a caring relationship with at least one adult. In addition, in our programs, students may have access to mental health staff in the schools, access to related services staff in the school environment again, and they may have involvement with county services and medical professionals, including psychiatry, so that there's a lot more support for the individual as well as their families. And in addition, when the young person may no longer be able to reside safely in their home, they may live in a group home staffed with supportive staff members. So our students, although they may present with increased risk, and when we've talked about some of the statistics, there's definitely increased risk for our students. However, because of our programming and because of partnerships with the medical field and the county services as well as families, we're able to provide more of a supportive net to help our youth and keep them safe. So sometimes the warning signs for youth with ID can present very differently than the signs for youth without ID. So for example, youth without ID may report that they're having these thoughts or that they are feeling suicidal. They may come to somebody to ask for help or just generally verbalize their distress. Many youth with ID do not use this way of communicating. So what we need to do instead is to look at a regression in functional skill levels or or an increase in outward behaviors. We're looking basically at change from from baseline behavior, a change from how they usually present. Now, for us in the schools, we see these young people daily. So over time, you will get to know the students really well, and you will be able to see when something seems to be up, something's different. So again, we're going to look at regression in functional skill level. We might see stereotypic and repetitive behaviors that are increasing in frequency. They may become more agitated and irritable, again, looking at a change from their baseline levels. Self-injurious behaviors might increase, and some may communicate about hurting or killing themselves, and this would be a new behavior or an increase in frequency. Something is different. The intensity is different. We're looking for change from how they normally present. Again, you will get to know your students best, and you might notice changes in their mood, their behavior, and you will also probably be the one that they will communicate with. They tend to communicate with who they feel safest with. Remember, if in doubt, just talk to one of the mental health support staff. It's best to err in the direction of caution. And so as a team, you can figure out if any actions are needed. Again, it's important. If you think something might be going on, just consult with somebody. It doesn't matter how small the problem is. The mental health team will be able to assist you.
Everyone wants to know the perfect thing to say, yet nobody has actually systematically researched the most effective things for school staff to say to a suicidal student. As a result, opinion and experience are the best we've got to go on for now. Results will vary according to a different student's needs, intellectual abilities, disabilities, and personalities. You might consider using some of these ideas on the slide here. However, your own relationship with the student that you are talking with should be your guide. And, of course, if you're feeling uncertain or unsure of what to say, you can always just listen. And just like we want to know what to say, we also want to avoid statements or comments that can have a negative impact on our intent to be supportive to a student. Knowing the warning signs is important, but knowing how to act is even more important. The action steps that I'm about to describe come from the QPR, the Question, Persuade, and Refer, which is an online evidence-based gatekeeper suicide prevention program. Although there are components of this training that mirror the QPR, your participation in this training does not qualify or constitute a QPR training. So if you're interested in additional training or support in the area of suicide prevention, you could seek out QPR Gatekeeper training to receive the QPR certification. Asking students about their support people is a good way to help them reframe their thoughts from no one cares to a someone cares mindset. If a student talks about not having a support system, you can respond by saying, "You're talking to me. You can add me to your list of supportive people." Talk to a student about who their friends are, what activities they do, extracurricular, community engagement. Ask them what school staff they like. Ask them what school staff they don't hate. Ask the student about our 916 school social workers, mental health specialist, or a school psychologist, and find out if there's somebody that they would feel comfortable talking more about this with. Should a student disclose to you that they are contemplating suicide or that they have engaged in self-injurious behaviors, it's imperative that staff keep eyes on them at all time. Provide adult supervision for the student and escort them to see their school social worker, our district mental health specialist, or a school psychologist. Also, be available to provide information to that student support person. Given that you were the person that the initial report was made to, the information that you convey will be very important as we provide a risk assessment for that student. If you are concerned about a student, always know that you can reach out to any of the 916 mental health support persons in order to connect with that student. As a school staff, you need to know that we're counting on you, both to initiate a referral should a student disclose that they are contemplating or have engaged in self-injurious behavior and or contemplating suicide, and help with the handoff to a 916 mental health staff so that we can collaborate together to ensure a student's safety. Should a student be identified as in need of, a 916 mental health staff will complete a suicide risk assessment. Risk assessments typically include discussion about the student's history of who their support people are, as well as conversations about stressors they are experiencing and if the student has a plan for committing suicide. Additional action steps will depend on the student's proactive behavior management plan, their social emotional history, and any additional IEP considerations. Action steps may include contact with the student's parent or guardian, utilizing emergency services, or reaching out to their outside providers. It's important to note that follow-up regarding the risk assessment is based on need to know, so you may not get resolution regarding the outcome of the situation. While suicide is preventable, should a death by suicide occur, our 916 mental health staff are ready to respond if there is a suicide or attempted suicide that impacts our school district. Therefore, being aware of suicide contagion and our school and district's efforts to ensure student safety post-suicide or attempted suicide are important. Suicide contagion is the exposure to suicide or suicidal behaviors within one's family, one's peer group, or through social media reports of suicide that can result in an increase in suicide and or suicidal behaviors. Suicide contagion is especially of concern for young people because they're more impulsive.